A decapitated head may remain aware for up to 30 seconds after being severed. A grotesque half-minute in which the eyes may blink, the mouth attempts speech, and consciousness lingers as life ebbs away. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, and arguably the most infamous queen ever executed, this horrifying reality was only one aspect of a death that most historical retellings often gloss over. The truth of Anne's final hours reveals psychological torment far more chilling than a mere stroke of the Bladian orchestrated political drama, designed not only to eliminate her physically, but to annihilate her legacy. Anne's execution serves as a stark example of Tudor England's merciless justice system, where execution was not just punishment, but the endpoint of a ritualized process of disgrace. Although many textbooks briefly mention she was executed for treason, the grim truth of her last days reveals a psychological breakdown so deliberately constructed it could rival the methods of modern interrogators. Her death wasn't just the close of a chapter, it was the final move in Henry VIII's mission to obliterate a woman who had become too influential for his liking. By May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had already endured more than 2 weeks locked inside the Tower of London's same fortress, where she had once awaited her coronation. Merely 3 years earlier, she had been crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now, she found herself trapped in a surreal purgatory, her death date postponed multiple times, each delay amplifying the psychological strain. Henry had even arranged for a swordsman from Calais to carry out the sentence, rather than employ the customary English axia gesture, often portrayed as merciful, though it in fact underlined the dramatic nature of the spectacle ahead. In her final hours, Anne displayed a disconcerting composure, which witnesses described as almost joyful as she readied herself for death. Today, psychologists might label this behavior as dissociation, a mental strategy triggered by extreme trauma. She even quipped that she would soon be called Anne sans tête, or Anne without a head, using dark humor as a shield against the inner chaos. Few chroniclers acknowledge the raw fear she must have experienced, knowing her image was being dismantled piece by piece through baseless claims of adultery, incest, and plots against the king. What makes Anne's demise particularly haunting is not solely the execution itself, but the systematic erasure of her identity. Henry didn't simply want her dead, he sought to wipe her from history, invalidate her accomplishments, and strip her daughter Elizabeth of legitimacy. Her beheading was the final act of a smear campaign crafted to convince the English public that their once admired queen was worthy of such a fate. In the final days leading up to her execution, Anne was forced to listen to obscene, fabricated stories of her alleged immorality claims, so absurd that no present-day legal system would entertain them. The morning of May 19th broke unusually bright over Londona, cruel contrast to the darkness about to descend. Anne had spent the night in prayer, though sleep eluded her again and again. Tower records show that Anne requested the sacrament around 2 a.m., kneeling for hours in desperate prayer before the consecrated host. By sunrise, she had been awake for nearly a full day, her mind likely fractured under the strain of anxiety and exhaustion. When the tower lieutenant arrived to escort her, she was reportedly laughing, with her attendants a reaction suggesting not serenity, but the signs of emotional collapse. Anne's execution had been arranged and postponed several times, a detail often overlooked as a method of psychological torment. The prolonged uncertainty of when death would actually come was no accident. It was a tactic employed to break the will of prisoners. When she was finally informed that her time had come, Anne was escorted from her chambers through the same passageways where, only 3 years earlier, she had walked with royal pride on the eve of her coronation. Now, she was surrounded not by admirers, but by guards tasked with preventing any escape attempt. The same noblemen who once revered her now watched her final march with stony detachment. The scaffold built at Tower Green was unusually modest, only 3 feet talon like the towering platforms often romanticized in popular media. This design required Anne to climb just a few steps, denying her the elevation that might have granted a sliver of dignity and bringing her uncomfortably close to the taunting crowd. While modern portrayals often paint the scene as solemn and reverent, historical evidence suggests the atmosphere was more akin to a grotesque fairground. It was, at its core, political theater meant as a warning to anyone, especially women, who dared rise too far above their assigned place. Before kneeling, Anne was granted a final statement not as a kindness, but because protocol demanded it. Her speech, measured and composed, reflected both her keen awareness of the stakes and the limited freedom she had left. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. This seeming acceptance of her fate was, in truth, her last quiet defiance. By acknowledging the law without admitting guilt, she subtly undermined the foundation of the charges leveled against her. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the day was Henry's conspicuous absence. Contrary to the popular notion that monarchs attended such moments of justice, Henry VIII remained at Whitehall, waiting for confirmation that his wife was dead. As the blade fell, he was reportedly celebrating his impending marriage to Jane Seymour, a chilling reflection of how utterly Anne had been discarded. Personal loyalty had been swallowed whole by political necessity. Her death wasn't the tragic end of a consort, but an expedient solution to the problem of succession. The executioner from Calais, specially commissioned and generously compensated for his skill, added yet another layer to the event's cold precision. English executions traditionally used axes, instruments that often required repeated blows to finish the act. The French swordsman, trained for swift decapitation in a single strike, may have offered efficiency but to Anne. He was a stranger. In her last moments, Anne faced execution at the hands of a foreigner, ultimate humiliation for a queen who had once held the gaze of an entire nation. The blindfold, often interpreted as an act of mercy to spare her from seeing the sword, actually served a more pragmatic function. It prevented any instinctive recoil that might have led to a failed blow. Instead of laying her head upon a traditional block, Anne knelt upright, a French custom that made the task more difficult for the executioner. This posture demanded immense self-control, requiring her to remain still purely by force of will as the swordsman readied his strike. Eyewitnesses recalled how she moved her lips constantly in prayer, her eyes shifting beneath the blindfold as if straining to detect the sound of the fatal blade approaching. This moment of unbearable anticipation, being aware that death was near, yet not knowing exactly when, constitutes a form of psychological torment rarely acknowledged in sanitized retellings of her demise. The actual execution was remarkably efficient by Tudor standards. With one clean sweep, her head was removed. Yet the aftermath, often excluded from traditional narratives, was just as haunting. Observers claimed her lips and eyes continued to move in the seconds following decapitation, a physiological reaction caused by lingering oxygen in the brain. Some even believed her lips may have resumed the prayer cut short by the sword. The image was so horrific that several onlookers fainted, while others turned away, unable to bear the sight, an unsettling reminder of how fragile the boundary is between body and soul. Perhaps the most revealing detail was that no coffin had been prepared for her. In a rush of panic and sorrow, her ladies-in-waiting had to locate an old arrow chest to hold her remains. What seems like a small oversight, in fact, reflects a total disregard for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was treated as an inconvenience, not as a sovereign deserving the most basic human rights. Her body was buried hastily in an unmarked grave beneath the floor of the chapel inside the tower. Without proper religious ritual, almost as though the king hoped her memory would vanish as swiftly as her life had been extinguished. Henry's campaign to erase Anne didn't end with her beheading. Artists were told to eliminate her image from official portraits. Her heraldic symbols were removed from royal buildings. Courtiers quickly learned that even uttering her name could place them in danger of falling from favor. Although many accounts focus solely on the violence of her execution, the deliberate erasure of Anne's presence from the collective memory is a more insidious form of violence. It was not only her body that was destroyed, it was her influence, her identity, her very legacy. It would take centuries before historians could begin piecing her story together from what little remained after Henry's purge. The trauma of Anne's execution also extended to those closest to her, especially her female attendants, who were tasked with preparing her severed head and body for burial. These women, already terrified they might be implicated in the same crimes fabricated against the Queen, were forced to perform this horrific duty while suppressing their own fear and grief. Several of her attendants reportedly endured recurring nightmares for years afterward, and at least one ultimately joined a convent, unable to remain at court after the horror she had witnessed. The psychological shockwaves rippled far beyond Anne herself, instilling an atmosphere of dread that lingered throughout Henry VIII's court for the remainder of his reign. In the wake of Anne's death, her young daughter, Elizabeth Barely, 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and stripped from the royal succession. The girl who would one day become England's most iconic monarch was, in effect, orphaned. Her mother was executed, and her father openly renounced her legitimacy. Court records indicate that Elizabeth was abruptly left without the proper garments or attendants suited to her former rank. Her household was dismantled nearly overnight. This heartless treatment of an innocent child adds yet another layer to the cruelty surrounding Anne's downfall. The punishment reached even her daughter. Modern portrayals of Tudor executions often fail to convey the brutal sensory onslaught they truly entailed. The scaffold likely stank of old blood from previous deaths. The warm May air thick with the buzz of flies. The roar of the crowd, heightened by planted onlookers, ordered to cheer the Queen's demise, formed a sonic wall designed to disorient and intimidate. As Anne was led toward Tower Green, she would have heard the escalating noise, including the taunts and cries of a populace trained to see her as a seductress and traitor. This orchestrated spectacle of humiliation was not incidental. It was central to Tudor-style punishment. Death alone was insufficient. Shame was required. Though pop culture often depicts Anne's last speech as an act of noble defiance, historical evidence suggests a far more complex truth. Her speech, in which she referred to Henry as a kind and sovereign lord, reflects the impossible tightrope she had to walk. Even with death moments away, Anne couldn't speak openly. Her words were shaped by fear for her daughter's future and the scrutiny of a hostile audience, rather than an expression of liberty. Her speech was a final submission to a regime that controlled even her last breath. The French sword used to end her life symbolized the performance embedded within the punishment. Henry VIII spared no cost in staging a downfall suited for royalty. The swordsman reportedly practiced on animals beforehand to ensure a swift, single-stroke earning the generous sum paid for his service. This calculated precision turning Anne's death into a technical task highlighted the chilling efficiency of state violence. Anne wasn't merely executed. She was funneled through a system designed to convert individual agony into a demonstration of power. Contemporary sources confirm that no English executioner would accept the job not from conscience, but due to the specialized training needed for the French technique. The sword itself, finely honed and distinct from the heavy English axe, delivered a clean horizontal cut, rather than the crude downward swing typical in England. This seemingly small detail only reinforced the stylized brutality of the spectacle. Even the method of execution was deliberately chosen for maximum dramatic effect and minimal physical disorder, ensuring the performance would proceed without the complications of a botched decapitation. After the blade had done its work, Thomas Wyattton, also a prisoner in the Tower, and a former admirer of Anne, wrote mournfully of the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it. His poetic reflection underscores the horrific transformation of Anne, from a resplendent queen to a lifeless object. Her head was quickly wrapped in linen by her sobbing attendants, but not before the executioner lifted it high by the hair. A ceremonial display meant to confirm to the spectators that justice had been served. This grisly presentation, with blood still pulsing from the severed neck, created a chilling final image that burned itself into the memories of those watching. Records from the Tower reveal that Anne's burial was so rushed, it left no room for meaningful religious rites. Her head and body were placed together in a makeshift coffin, an old arrow chest, and buried beneath the chapel floor, among others who had been executed. For a former Queen of England, it was an unworthy and shameful end. No grave marker was installed, and for generations her final resting place remained a mystery. This erasure of her burial site marked the climax of Henry's broader campaign, not merely to kill Anne, but to remove her entirely from the historical record. In many ways, that campaign nearly succeeded. In the immediate days after her death, Henry's spin doctors worked fervently to reshape public perception. Poets who had once praised Anne's charm and intelligence now turned on her, composing works that vilified her as a manipulative traitor. Official reports highlighted the mercy of Henry's decision to use a foreign swordsman instead of the usual English axe, reframing his performative choice as a sign of compassion. The gruesome details of her death were carefully omitted, starting a process of historical cleansing that still affects how Anne's execution is remembered today. What may unsettle us most now is the sheer swiftness with which Henry resumed normal life. The day after Anne's execution, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Just 2 weeks later, he wed her quietly at Whitehall Palace. This unfeeling haste reveals that Anne's death was not a personal tragedy for the king, but a coldly efficient solution to a dynastic problem. She had not produced a male heir, so she was discarded and replaced. Her death was sacrificed on the altar of power politics. The psychological abuse Anne endured did not begin at the scaffold. In the weeks prior, she was subjected to intense interrogations, deprived of sleep, and cut off from any friendly presence. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief advisor and the architect of her downfall, utilized tactics strikingly similar to those of modern psychological torment: mental disorientation, isolation, forced fatigue, and the manipulation of false evidence. By the time Anne reached the platform, she had already been broken down emotionally, a deliberate campaign designed to ensure her final moments would unfold without resistance, without protest. Official records detail the extraordinary security arrangements put in place for Anne Boleyn's execution measures, far beyond what was typical. Even for those accused of treason, the garrison at the tower was doubled, and guards were stationed strategically throughout the fortress. These heightened precautions were not meant to stop an escape attempt. Rather, they were designed to prevent any loyalist from making a last-minute intervention or stirring public unrest on Anne's behalf. This overwhelming show of force served another, more psychological purpose: to suppress any sympathy and enforce silent submission to the king's decision. The execution was scheduled for late morning, not the usual break of day, to allow for maximum public visibility. Although only a select group of nobles and officials could gather at Tower Green, the tower's visibility allowed large crowds to witness, or at least hear, the grim confirmation from outside. Across London, church bells tolled at the moment of her death, transforming a queen's final moments into a coordinated demonstration of royal control. Anne's personal agony had been fully converted into political spectacle. One of the most neglected aspects of Anne's death is the fate of her co-accused. 5 men, among them her brother George Boleyn, were executed just days earlier on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths laid the foundation for the accusations against Anne, and by eliminating them beforehand, authorities ensured none could publicly contradict the fabricated evidence. The orchestrated killing of 6 people condemned using nearly identical false testimonies stands as one of the most blatant instances of political violence in Tudor England, akin to the staged purges of totalitarian regimes centuries later. Today, Tower Green features a memorial marking the supposed location of Anne's execution. But historical records suggest the scaffold was actually positioned elsewhere within the complex. This confusion over geography mirrors the larger historical trend. Anne's story has been repeatedly reinterpreted, both physically and narratively, to fit shifting agendas. The romanticized depictions in popular media bear little resemblance to the psychological warfare, slander, and strategic cruelty that defined her final days in May 1536. The true terror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not only in the beheading itself, but in understanding it as the endpoint of a methodical plan to dismantle a woman who had risen too far in a patriarchal society. She was not simply put to death. She was deliberately disassembled, her character smeared, her legacy buried, and her very presence in the historical record nearly obliterated. When we explore the complete context of mental torture, public disgrace, the choreographed theatrics, and the systematic erasure of memory, face a form of horror more profound than the executioner's blade. From a modern psychological lens, Anne's execution reads like a textbook case of authoritarian gaslighting. and orchestrated character assassination. The accusation, ranging from incest and infidelity to plotting to poison the king, were so outrageous that no legitimate court today would entertain them. And yet, through calculated manipulation of public perception, strategic deployment of torture to obtain confessions from the men accused alongside her, and complete control over the official story, Henry VIII's regime successfully persuaded many that Anne Boleyn deserved her grim fate. This deliberate distortion of reality reshaping facts to fit a political agenda may be the most chilling element of her execution. Even 500 years later, Anne's death continues to captivate us, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of personal devastation and political strategy. Her execution was not simply the termination of a life, it was a stage-managed act meant to justify a monarch's actions and recast historical memory. The deepest horror lies not in the blade itself, but in the revelation of how thoroughly power can manipulate truth. It's a lesson that echoes with unsettling clarity in our modern world of media distortion and public vilification. Anne's final irony may be that, despite Henry's attempt to obliterate her legacy, it was her brutal death, not her life, that endured in historical memory. To fully grasp the horror of Anne Boleyn's end is to confront uncomfortable realities about the dynamics of power, the role of gender, and the shaping of historical narratives. The sanitized version, an unfortunate queen, granted a swift and noble death, masks the deeper atrocity, the systematic abuse of royal authority that her case so powerfully illustrates. By exploring the psychological dimension of her final days, the engineered suffering, the orchestrated disgrace, the destruction of her image, and the efforts to erase her from history, gain insight not only into the brutality of Tudor justice, but into the ways power sustains itself through control over both the human body and public narrative. In Anne Boleyn's severed head, we see more than execution. We see a haunting symbol of how truth itself can be dismantled under the weight of unchecked power.